In 1987, 17-year-old Claire Weaver vanished on a Texas backroad. Her car was found still running, driver's door open, radio humming the last few notes of a country song. For 38 years, no one could explain what happened that night. Until now, this is the Silent Mile, the 1987 Texas cold case solved. Before we begin, hit subscribe for more true stories. October 3rd, 1987, Redwater, Texas. The two-lane road shimmered under the last light of dusk, stretching toward nowhere. Dust curled in lazy spirals behind Claire Weaver's cherry-red Monte Carlo as she steered one-handed, the other drumming against the wheel to the rhythm of Bon Jovi on the radio. She was 17, restless, all nerves and optimism. The kind of girl small towns remember forever because she'd planned to leave them. She'd just finished her shift at the diner off Route 23, still wearing her uniform, her white sneakers faintly stained from spilled coffee. The sun dropped behind the low hills, and the air cooled quick, Texas autumn, when nights came fast and sharp. Claire rolled down her window, letting in the scent of dry grass and creosote. When she passed the sign for County Road 54, she hesitated. That was the shortcut home, a narrow road cutting through farmland and scrub forest. She'd driven it 100 times. Still, something about the evening felt different. Headlights flashed in her rearview mirror, a pickup following close. She eased off the gas, hoping the driver would pass. Instead, the truck matched her speed. Her pulse quickened. Claire flicked her turn signal and pulled onto the shoulder. The truck did too, stopping 20 feet behind. Its engine idled, a deep, steady growl. She waited, frozen, hoping the driver would simply go around. When no one moved, she leaned out her window. "Hey, you need something?" The truck's headlights flared brighter, high beams now. Claire blinked against the glare. Then, through the light, a silhouette climbed from the driver's side. Tall, deliberate. The song on Claire's radio hit its final chorus. Shot through the heart, and you're to blame. The sound cut off. Only the wind moved across County Road 54. When a farmer found the Monte Carlo the next morning, the driver's door hung open, keys still in the ignition. Claire's purse was on the passenger seat, her ID and cash untouched. The ground showed scuffed dirt near the ditch, as if someone had been dragged. She was never seen again. Present day, February 2025. The wind that crossed Redwater in winter smelled of rust and smoke. It carried the same unease that had haunted Detective Roy Bannon since the day he retired. A whisper from every unsolved case file still stacked in his garage. He sat at his desk in the converted shed behind his house, the kind of place that felt more like confession than workspace. A tape recorder clicked on, and his gravelly voice filled the quiet. Episode 43, The Silent Mile. Redwater, Texas. Victim, Claire Weaver, age 17. Last seen October 3rd, 1987. This case defined my career, or maybe it ruined it. Roy rubbed his temples. The scar on his jaw, a remnant from a car crash decades earlier, tugged faintly when he frowned. When he'd launched his podcast Backroad's Justice, he'd meant it as therapy, a way to give voice to the forgotten. But the emails that came in after every episode only deepened the ache. People begging for closure he couldn't give. Until last week. An anonymous message had arrived through his show's tip line. No name, just a voice distorted through static. "Check the well behind the old Weaver place. You'll find her." At first, he dismissed it as another cruel hoax. The Weavers had sold that property long ago, and the house had fallen into ruin. But something about the tremor in the caller's tone, part fear, part guilt, lodged itself in Roy's chest. Now, as he stared at the spread of old photographs on his desk, he couldn't ignore it. Claire's senior portrait smiled up at him. Soft curls, freckled cheeks, an innocence untouched by the road that had taken her. Next to it, a black and white crime scene photo. Her empty car, the open door, a single shoe half buried in gravel. Roy reached for his recorder again. It's been 38 years since Claire disappeared. They called it a runaway. I called it unfinished business. He stood, his joints protesting, and slipped his coat from the chair. Outside, the dusk was settling, not unlike that October night long ago. The air tasted of cold dust and burned oak from someone's fireplace. He climbed into his truck, the old engine rumbling to life, headlights cutting through the dark. The road to the Weaver property wound past the high school football field and the faded gas station that still bore a hand-painted sign. Coldest beer in McLennan County. Roy passed it slowly, watching the shadows gather in the corners of the lot. Small towns didn't forget. They just got quieter. When he reached the edge of the old Weaver land, his headlights swept across a sagging fence and the ghost of a farmhouse barely standing against the wind. The front porch roof had caved in, and the windows gaped open like black eyes. He killed the engine and listened. Coyotes yipped in the distance. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and something faintly metallic. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped into the weeds. The crunch of dry grass echoed like footsteps too close behind him. The well sat behind the house, just as the caller had said. Stone rim, wooden cover half rotted through. Roy crouched, sweeping his light across the moss-dark stones. For years he'd walked through this kind of moment in his dreams, always about to find something, always waking before he did. He pulled a pry bar from his bag and wedged it under the cover. The wood gave with a splintering groan. Cold air rose from the darkness below. He shone the beam down. For a second, he saw only damp brick and a reflection of light on water. Then the beam caught on something pale, small, curved. A skull. Roy froze. His heart hammered in his chest, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. He whispered, not for the recorder this time, but for himself. Claire Weaver, I think I just found you. His voice cracked on the last word. The well exhaled a chill that carried 38 years of silence up from its depths. By morning, the Weaver property had transformed from a forgotten ruin into the epicenter of chaos. Sheriff's cruisers idled along the dirt road, their lights flashing dull red against the gray dawn. Crime scene tape fluttered in the cold wind like prayer flags for the dead. News vans had already arrived, their reporters setting up just beyond the perimeter, breath steaming as they rehearsed lines for the noon broadcast. Roy stood at the fence, collar turned up against the wind. The pale January light made the landscape look bleached and brittle, as if the color had drained from it after all these years. He watched as the forensic team lowered a bucket and rope into the well, their movements methodical, reverent. "Morning, Detective," came a voice behind him. Roy turned to see Sheriff Elaine Mercer, her silver hair tied back, the lines around her mouth deeper than he remembered. She'd been a rookie when Claire vanished, the first on the scene back in '87. "Didn't think I'd ever see this place again," she said quietly, her boots crunching over frost. "You really think this is her?" Roy nodded once. "We'll know soon enough." Mercer sighed, exhaling a thin cloud of breath. "I remember the search. We brought in dogs, choppers, the whole works. That well was dry back then, sealed over. Guess no one thought to open it. Someone sealed it after she was gone," Roy said, voice low. "That's not neglect. That's concealment." A shout came from the well. The forensic lead, a thin man in a windbreaker, waved them over. "We've got remains." Partial skeleton. Appears female. Roy felt the air thicken. He forced himself to walk forward, each step heavy. He'd seen death in all its forms, but cold cases carried a unique gravity, the weight of stolen decades. As the first fragment came into view, a slender arm bone slick with moisture, the silence deepened. The technicians worked with careful precision. transferring each fragment into evidence bags. The sound of plastic rustling against bone made Roy's stomach twist. Mercer knelt beside the table where the remains were being catalogued. "Look at the ring," she murmured. Roy leaned closer. A tarnished silver band still clung to one finger, its tiny turquoise stone dulled by years underground. "That's Claire's," Mercer said. "Her boyfriend at the time, that kid, Kyle Landry, gave it to her senior year." Roy nodded grimly. "Then it's her." He turned to the crime scene photographer. "Get a clean series before they move anything else." The flash popped against the pale light, bleaching the scene momentarily white. Roy looked away, the image already burned into memory. By afternoon, the site was sealed and the remains on their way to the state lab in Austin. Reporters swarmed the roadside, shouting questions as Roy and Mercer emerged. "Detective Bannon, is this the body of Claire Weaver? Is it true a tip led you here? Are you reopening the Redwater disappearances?" Roy ignored them, moving toward his truck. Mercer followed, shielding her eyes from the glare of camera flashes. Once inside, the quiet felt almost violent. Roy sat with both hands on the wheel, staring through the windshield at the empty field beyond. "Whoever called that tip line," Mercer said softly, "they wanted this found. Why now, after all these years?" Roy thought of the voice on the recording, distorted, trembling. "Because guilt has an expiration date," he said, "and someone's just run out of time." They drove back toward town, the radio filled with breaking news bulletins. Claire Weaver's name had returned to the airwaves, resurrected from the archives. That evening, Roy sat in his shed again, a single desk lamp casting long shadows across the walls. The tape recorder clicked on. February 6th, 2025. Remains recovered from the Weaver property. Preliminary ID pending. For 38 years, people asked what happened on County Road 54. Maybe we're finally about to find out. He stopped the tape and rubbed his eyes. The years pressed heavy on his shoulders. On the desk beside him lay the ring, sealed in its evidence bag, glinting faintly under the light. He picked up the case file, flipping to a page marked Persons of Interest. Kyle Landry, Claire's boyfriend, 19 in 1987. Questioned, never charged. Moved to Houston, 2 DUIs. A domestic dispute in the 90s, then vanished from public record. Paul Weaver, Claire's father, a foreman at the Redwater Grain Co-op. Died in 2003, heart attack. Known drinker, volatile temper. Doris Weaver, Claire's mother, still alive. Nursing home in Temple. Roy exhaled slowly. Tomorrow, he'd start with Doris. The next morning, sunlight cut across the kitchen table as he filled a thermos of coffee. His reflection in the window caught him by surprise. Gray hair, tired eyes, and a face that still carried the shadow of the young detective he used to be. He drove east on Highway 95, the sky wide and colorless. Radio silent except for the hum of tires on asphalt. The nursing home sat at the edge of town, surrounded by bare pecan trees and the smell of disinfectant. Inside, an orderly led him down a corridor lined with faded photographs of happier residents. Doris Weaver sat by the window, small and frail, her white hair a halo in the sunlight. When she turned, her eyes, pale blue and watery, fixed on him with a weary kind of recognition. "You were one of them," she said quietly. "Back then, the detectives." "Yes, ma'am," Roy replied, pulling up a chair. "Roy Bannon." Her hands trembled slightly as she folded them in her lap. "They said she ran away." "Everyone said that, but I knew my Claire didn't run." Roy nodded. "You were right. We found her, Mrs. Weaver." Her eyes filled instantly. "Where?" "On your old property. In the well." For a moment she didn't breathe. Then she whispered, "That well was sealed in '88. Paul said he couldn't stand the sight of it. They poured concrete over it." Roy frowned. "Concrete?" She nodded. voice trembling. Paul said he couldn't stand the sight of it anymore. But... She paused, eyes unfocused, searching memory. The night before he did it, I heard something outside, hammering, like wood. I thought he was fixing the fence. Roy felt his pulse quicken. Could it have been him sealing it early? Her gaze met his, steady now. I think Paul knew something. And someone helped him. Roy's coffee had gone cold. But his mind was burning. The ghosts of 1987 were stirring again. And somewhere among them, a living voice had just pointed him toward the next door. The rain came overnight, drumming softly against Roy Bannon's truck as he pulled into the diner on Main Street. By morning, Redwater was wrapped in fog, the kind that made headlights look like ghosts drifting through milk. He sat in his usual booth by the window, nursing bitter coffee that had been burning on the warmer since dawn. The local paper lay open before him. Breakthrough. In 1987, Redwater disappearance. Human remains found on former Weaver property. The photo beneath the headline showed him beside Sheriff Mercer at the scene, face grim, eyes half closed mid-blink. He hated how the press always captured that expression, the look of a man still trying to atone. Across the diner, old-timers whispered over biscuits and gravy. Every conversation in town had drifted back to 1987 overnight. He'd meant to drive straight to Austin for the lab briefing, but something about Doris Weaver's words wouldn't leave him. Paul sealed the well in '88. I heard hammering the night before. Roy unfolded a map of the property from the old file and studied the lines, tracing the boundary fence, the house, the well. If Paul had sealed it early, why tell his wife a year later? Why fake the timing? He slid a 20 under his cup and headed out. The nursing home receptionist gave him a faintly suspicious look when he returned. Mrs. Weaver already had visitors this morning, she said. Family? The woman shook her head. Didn't say. Middle-aged man, dark jacket. He brought flowers. She seemed shaken afterward. Roy's stomach tightened. Do you have a visitor log? The receptionist hesitated, then turned the clipboard toward him. The last entry. K. Landry, 10:42 a.m. Kyle Landry. Roy exhaled slowly. Mind if I see her again? 10 minutes, the woman said. She's resting. When he entered the room, Doris sat staring out the rain-streaked window. The flowers, lilies, sat in a vase on the sill, already shedding pollen like yellow dust. He came, she said without turning. Kyle Landry? She nodded, said he still dreams about her. Asked if I'd forgiven him. I told him forgiveness is for people who stop lying. Roy moved closer. Did he threaten you? No. A pause. He just looked empty. Like he'd already been punished, Roy studied her profile. Frail, but sharp behind the eyes. Mrs. Weaver, may I ask about your husband? You said you thought he knew something. She clasped her hands together. After Claire disappeared, Paul changed. He stopped going to work, stopped shaving. He'd sit out by that well for hours, drinking. One night, I found him with her diary in his lap. You still have it? Her thin lips pressed together. I gave it to the pastor when we left town. Said it wasn't fit for me to read anymore. Do you remember what it said? She hesitated. Only one thing. The last page. She wrote, if Dad knew about the letters, he'd kill him. Roy's pulse quickened. Letters from who? I don't know. She was secretive. Maybe Kyle. Maybe someone else. Doris turned from the window at last, her expression fierce despite the tremor in her jaw. Detective, whoever sealed that well, they did it to bury more than bones. By early afternoon, the rain had stopped, leaving the field steaming under a pale sun. Roy drove to the small Baptist church that had outlived nearly everyone who'd built it. The pastor, Reverend Bell, was in his 80s now, his spine bent like an old nail, but his eyes bright with memory. I remember Claire Weaver, he said, leading Roy into his office lined with hymnals and dust. Sweet girl. Sang in choir 2 summers running, she kept a diary. Her mother says she gave it to you. Belle nodded slowly. I did keep it for a time. Thought the words might ease the mother's mind. But Paul Weaver came by not long after. He asked for it back. Roy felt the old tension coil in his chest. He got it? The pastor shook his head. I told him no. Something in his eyes. Not grief, exactly. More like panic. Next morning, the diary was gone. Window pried open, Roy scanned the shelves. You never made a copy? Not of the diary. But... Belle reached into a drawer and pulled out a yellowed envelope. This was slipped under my door 2 weeks after Claire vanished. No return address. Inside was a single photograph. Claire at the diner, laughing with another man, not Kyle. The man was older, maybe mid-30s, wearing a Redwater grain co-op jacket. Roy's breath caught. That's her father's co-worker. Earl Dunham. The Reverend nodded. I told the police back then, but they said the picture proved nothing. Earl left town the day after she disappeared. Roy stared at the photo. The man's hand rested lightly on Claire's shoulder. Casual, almost possessive. Behind them, the clock on the diner wall read 9:12 p.m. That was roughly 40 minutes before she vanished. He slipped the photograph carefully into an evidence sleeve. Thank you, Reverend. You've just reopened this case for good. Twilight settled over Redwater as Roy drove back toward his shed. The sky was bruised purple, the kind that made the landscape feel haunted. He pinned the photograph to his corkboard beside the map and stepped back. Strings of red thread stretched between faces and dates. The old investigation reborn. Paul Weaver sealed the well. Earl Dunham, last seen with Claire. Kyle Landry reappears after 38 years. Roy's phone buzzed on the desk, an unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. Bannon. Static. Then a man's voice, low and ragged. You shouldn't have dug her up. The line went dead. Roy stared at the phone until the dial tone faded. The night outside felt suddenly alive, as if the whole town had turned its head to watch him. He reached for his recorder, pressed record, and spoke softly. Episode 44, The Mother's Secret. Someone sealed a well, someone stole a diary, and someone just called to warn me off, which means... He glanced at the photograph, the girl's smile frozen forever. I'm finally getting close. By sunrise, the fog had burned off Redwater. The air smelled of wet cedar and diesel from passing grain trucks. Roy Bannon had been awake all night, pacing his shed, replaying that phone call in his head. You shouldn't have dug her up. He kept hearing the tremor in the caller's voice. Not anger, but fear. Someone out there knew the truth and was terrified of it seeing daylight. On his board, he'd circled 2 names in red, Paul Weaver and Earl Dunham. One dead, one vanished. And between them, the diary that had gone missing from Reverend Bell's office 38 years ago. Roy poured another cup of burnt coffee and stared at the photograph of Claire and Earl in the diner. The man's hand rested just a little too long on her shoulder. You could tell by the way she leaned away from it. Subtle, but clear. He made a list of what he needed. Earl Dunham's employment records from the Redwater Co-op. A copy of the concrete pour permit from 1988, when Paul Weaver sealed the well. Any surviving police logs mentioning a break-in at the church. He tucked the photograph into an evidence envelope and headed out. The co-op still stood on the edge of town, its steel silos towering like gray cathedrals. The office smelled of dust, motor oil, and burnt coffee, the same as it had in the 80s. The clerk, a man in his 40s wearing a cap with the company logo, eyed Roy cautiously. We heard about the bones, he said. Half the town's talking. I just need employment files from 1987 to 1988. Name's Earl Dunham. The clerk disappeared into a back room. Roy heard filing cabinets screech open. the soft shuffle of papers. "Got one," the man said, returning with a yellow folder. "He quit November '87, no forwarding address." Just up and left, Roy scanned the form. Earl's emergency contact was listed as Paul Weaver, handwritten in pencil. He felt his stomach drop. "You mind if I make a copy of this?" he asked. The clerk shrugged. "As long as you bring it back." Outside, the sky had turned a brittle blue. Roy sat in his truck staring at the page. Paul Weaver and Earl Dunham had been close enough for one to list the other as kin. He flipped the folder again. A pay stub was stapled to the back. Earl's final check never cashed. The address field was blank, but on the stub someone had scrawled a note in blue ink. "Owed 2 weeks, CPW." Roy exhaled sharply. CPW, Paul Weaver. The men were entangled in something that had ended the same week Claire disappeared. He drove to the county records office in Waco. The clerk there, a young woman with earbuds tucked under her hair, looked up from her screen. "I'm looking for construction or permit filings for the Weaver property. Concrete work, 1988. She typed quickly, squinting at the monitor. "Here, February 17th, 1988. Private contractor, signed by Earl Dunham. Not by Paul Weaver." Roy leaned closer. "Earl Dunham poured the concrete?" "That's what it says." He requested a copy and thanked her, but his hands shook as he folded the printout. The evidence was stacking up in a single direction. Earl had sealed that well. Maybe not to help hide Claire's body, but to bury his own mistake. By late afternoon, Roy was back on the road to Redwater. The February light had turned golden, spilling over the fields like dust. His phone buzzed. Sheriff Mercer. "Lab confirmed identity," she said without preamble. "It's Claire Weaver. Dental match." Time of death consistent with the night she vanished. Roy gripped the wheel. Did they say cause? Blunt trauma to the skull. And one more thing. They found fibers embedded in bone, polyester blend. Work glove material, consistent with what the co-op issued in the '80s. "Earl's gloves," Roy murmured. Mercer exhaled. "You think he killed her?" "I think he helped cover it," Roy said. "And I think Paul Weaver made him." "Paul's dead. Then we find what he left behind." Night fell early. Roy parked outside the Weaver farmhouse again. Crime scene tape fluttering in the cold breeze. He'd brought a flashlight, camera, and the old key Mercer had loaned him. Inside, the house smelled of mildew and dust. Wallpaper peeled in long curls. The living room still held a rusted space heater and an upturned chair. He moved slowly, beams sweeping across the walls. Something caught the light. A nail, hammered into the floorboards near the hearth, with a string tied around it. He knelt, tugged gently. The board shifted, groaning. Beneath it lay a shallow cavity, lined with plastic wrap. Inside, a small, water-damaged notebook bound in cracked red leather. Roy's breath caught. The diary. He carried it to the window where the moonlight pooled and began to turn the brittle pages. Most of the ink had bled, but fragments remained readable. June 14th. E says Dad worries too much. He promises our secret's safe. July 2nd. Kyle keeps calling. I can't tell him about E. He'd hate me. August 19th. E says he's leaving town soon. He wants me to go too. October 3rd. Dad found one of the letters. He's furious. I'm scared he'll... The line ended in a jagged ink stroke that trailed off the page. Roy's pulse thudded in his ears. The letters. The older man. The fear. He flipped to the inside cover. Written faintly in pencil. If anything happens to me, it's because of them both. Both, Roy whispered. Paul and Earl. A sound outside made him freeze. The crunch of gravel. He snapped the diary shut, killed his flashlight, and crouched low behind the window. Headlights swept briefly across the porch, then vanished. A truck idled for several seconds, unseen behind the trees, before pulling away down the road. Roy waited until silence returned. heart pounding. Whoever had called him was still watching. He slipped the diary into his jacket, locked the door behind him, and stood in the yard under a sky full of cold stars. Episode 45. He whispered to the recorder. The missing diary has surfaced. Claire Weaver feared two men. One's in the ground. The other's been silent for 38 years. And somebody out there wants to keep it that way. The next morning brought clear skies and the kind of brittle sunlight that exposes everything. Roy Bannon hadn't slept. The red leather diary sat open on his desk like a wound that wouldn't close. He read the last entry again, the half-finished sentence that ended with, "I'm scared he'll—" The pen stroke bled downward, as if her hand had been torn away mid-word. He ran a thumb over the warped pages, feeling the ghost of her handwriting beneath his skin. If anything happens to me, it's because of them both. Paul and Earl, father and co-worker, bound by something foul enough to stay buried 38 years. Roy pressed record on his handheld mic. Episode 46, Echoes in Concrete. The diary confirms two men knew what happened the night Claire Weaver vanished. Her father sealed her body in a well, and his friend helped him do it. The question now is, why? He paused, staring at the photograph of Claire pinned above the board. The answer, he whispered, might be in what Earl Dunham left behind. By mid-morning, Roy was back at the county archives in Waco. The clerk, recognizing him, handed over a slim folder before he even asked. "Thought you might come back," she said. "We found something in the old employment microfilm. An injury report. August 1987. Worker, Earl Dunham. Filed by foreman, Paul Weaver." Roy flipped it open. Laceration, left palm, treated on site, witness, C. Weaver. He exhaled slowly. Claire had been there when Earl got hurt. A shared secret at the co-op. Maybe that's where it began. Not an affair, but attention. The kind of attention that festers. "What happened to Dunham after he quit?" he asked. The clerk typed again. "No forwarding address, but there's a canceled check mailed to an address in Bastrop County, early 1988. Construction subcontractor listed him for a week. After that, nothing. Can I get the address?" She nodded, printed it, and handed it over. The road to Bastrop cut through pine forests, the landscape changing from flat farmland to rolling shadowed hills. Roy kept the radio off. The silence pressed in, broken only by the rattle of loose coins in the cup holder. The address led to a trailer park on the edge of town. Half the lots were empty, grass growing through cracked pavement. The air smelled faintly of burnt plastic and old rain. He found Lot 7, a collapsed trailer, roof sunken, windows gone. A faded mailbox still bore the name E. Dunham. He stepped out, boots crunching over shards of glass. Something metallic caught his light, a half-buried license plate in the mud. The numbers were barely legible, but he photographed it anyway. He walked around back. The ground there was uneven. A shallow pit half filled with broken cinder blocks and poured cement. He crouched, scraping away loose dirt. Underneath, the concrete looked hastily set, uneven, as if poured in panic. Roy stood still, the hairs rising on his arms. He knew that pattern. He'd seen it before, at the Weaver well. He called Mercer. "I think I found where Dunham disappeared." Her voice crackled through static. "You're saying he's buried there?" "I'm saying whoever silenced him didn't want him talking, and they used the same signature. I'll send a unit," Mercer said. "Stay put." While he waited, Roy wandered back to his truck and opened the diary again, flipping to the front where the ink had faded almost to nothing. Beneath one corner, pressed between the pages, was a strip of paper he hadn't noticed before. A torn photograph fragment. It showed the corner of a porch, a man's leg in work pants, and the hem of a girl's floral dress. On the back, written in pencil, September 25th, before the rain. He studied the handwriting. Not Claire's, heavier, more angular. maybe Earl's, before the rain. A week before she vanished. He slipped the fragment into an envelope just as Mercer's SUV pulled up, tires crackling on gravel. 2 deputies climbed out, shovels and equipment in hand. They worked in grim silence as daylight thinned. The first hit of metal on stone rang sharp through the still air. Within minutes, they uncovered a slab with rebar visible through crumbling concrete. "Looks like a shallow pour over something hollow," one deputy said. Mercer glanced at Roy. "You ready for this?" He nodded. They pried up the slab with crowbars. The smell hit first: earth, rust, and something older: bones. Inside the cavity lay a human skeleton curled against itself, still wearing the remnants of a denim jacket. Mercer crouched, shining her flashlight. "There's a wallet." Roy leaned in as she extracted it. Inside, a faded driver's license. Earl Dunham. Mercer exhaled. "Guess he didn't make it far." Roy stared at the remains. Someone killed him and buried him here. Same method, same concrete. She stood. "Paul Weaver." Roy shook his head. "No, Weaver was dead by 2003. Dunham disappeared in '88. Someone else finished the job for him." Mercer looked out toward the highway, her breath visible in the cold air. "So who ties it together?" Roy didn't answer. His eyes drifted to the tree line beyond the lot. The world had gone quiet, except for the faint ticking of cooling metal. "Someone's been watching me," he said finally. "Someone who called the tip line. Maybe they're not afraid of what we'll find. Maybe they're afraid we'll find them." Mercer studied him for a long moment. "You think it's Landry? Or someone who thinks like him?" He crouched beside the grave one last time, staring at the cracked concrete that had silenced 2 people. "Concrete doesn't forget," he murmured. "It just waits for the right storm." Hours later, back in his shed, Roy uploaded the photos from the site. The image of the wallet glowed on his monitor. Earl's name, the lamination peeling. Beneath it, the diary lay open beside his recorder. He hit record. Episode 47, Echoes in Concrete, Part 2. We found a second body. Earl Dunham buried in his own backyard, the same pattern used to hide Claire Weaver. The man who sealed one grave ended up inside another. He paused, staring into the dark outside the window. Someone out there decided this story was finished long ago. But stories don't end when the truth's buried. They end when somebody finally digs it up. As he clicked off the recorder, headlights swept briefly across the wall. Too close, too slow. Roy froze. A vehicle idled outside for 10 seconds, maybe more, before pulling away down the street. When the sound faded, Roy whispered into the silence, "You're running out of places to hide." Dawn came cold and brittle, the kind of light that makes a man feel older. Roy Bannon stood at his shed window, mug in hand, watching frost form on the truck windshield. He hadn't slept. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the concrete pit and the shape curled inside. 2 graves now, 2 secrets joined by one silence. He switched on the recorder. Episode 48. The caller. "Someone's been warning me off. The same voice that led me to Claire Weaver's remains might hold the last piece of this story. Today, I'm finding out who it is." He clicked it off and opened his laptop. The call logs from his podcast's tip line were already queued. The audio engineer in Austin had traced the number that left the original message, the one distorted through static. The trace led not to a burner, but to a landline registered to Kyle Landry. Though caller ID can be SPO, Roy stared at the name. Kyle, Claire's boyfriend. The same man who'd shown up at Doris Weaver's nursing home 2 days earlier. He grabbed his jacket and the diary, then dialed Sheriff Mercer as he walked to the truck. "Elaine, I've got a lead on our caller." "Who?" "Kyle Landry. He's living in Temple, under his own name. No arrests since '96, but he's scared." That voice on the message wasn't threatening, it was confessing. Mercer's pause on the other end was long. "Be careful, Roy. If he's part of this, you're walking into a corner." Then I'll take the recorder with me. Temple was an hour east, the highway cutting through wide fields glittering with dew. Roy kept the heater low, the tape deck silent. The world outside felt deceptively calm, the kind of stillness that comes before something breaks. He found Landry's address in a cul-de-sac of weather-worn houses near a feed mill. A rusted mailbox bore the name E.K. Landry, its paint flaking like old scabs. Roy parked across the street and watched for a minute. Curtains stirred in the front window. Someone was awake. He walked up the path and knocked. The door opened halfway. Kyle Landry stood framed in the shadow, early 60s now, heavy set, eyes rimmed red. "You're him," Kyle said quietly. "The podcast man." "Roy Bannon," he said, showing his badge, though it hadn't meant much in years. "You called me." Kyle's eyes darted past him to the empty street. "Come in." Inside, the house smelled of dust and old smoke. Newspapers were stacked in corners, untouched coffee cups lined the counter. Roy set the recorder on the table and pressed record. "Kyle, the night Claire disappeared, you were questioned but never charged. You said you went home after your shift at the station." Kyle nodded slowly. "That's true, but you knew about the well." He flinched. "I didn't, not then. I found out later. How?" Kyle rubbed his face with both hands. "Paul told me." Roy leaned forward. "Her father told you?" Kyle nodded again. 2 weeks after it happened. He came by the station drunk, said I ruined his family, that I'd started something she couldn't finish. I thought he meant the fights we'd had. Then he said she was sleeping now, and that the well was quiet again. Roy felt the air thicken. "Why didn't you go to the police?" Kyle gave a bitter laugh. "Because the sheriff back then was Paul's cousin. Nobody was going to believe the kid everyone said made her run off." Roy studied him carefully. "So why call me now?" Kyle looked up, eyes rimmed with tears that never quite fell. "Because I heard something on your podcast. Episode 1, you said, every small town has a ghost road. And I thought, if someone digs deep enough, maybe they'll find mine." He reached into a drawer and pulled out a small cassette tape. Its label faded. "I kept this all these years. I didn't know who else to give it to." Roy turned it over, scrawled on the label, October 2nd, 87. Claire W. "She left it on my porch the night before she vanished," Kyle said. "I never played it until last month." Roy's fingers shook as he slid the tape into his old recorder. Static hissed, then a young woman's voice, bright, trembling. "Kyle, I need to tell you something. Dad found one of the letters from Earl. He thinks I'm involved with him. I swear I'm not the way he says. Earl just scared me. He said he'd tell Dad I'd been sneaking out unless I helped him. I'm going to the diner to meet him. Tell him to stop. I'll be home soon." Then, faintly, another voice in the background. Male, angry, distant. "You think you can keep this from me?" The tape clicked off. Roy looked up slowly. "That's Paul Weaver." Kyle nodded. "I think so. Earl must have called him." I didn't hear from either of them again. Roy pressed stop. His throat was dry. "This changes everything." Kyle leaned forward. "Detective, whatever you're doing, you need to stop. If you dig too far, you'll end up like Earl." Roy's gaze hardened. "You think Paul killed Earl?" Kyle hesitated. Paul didn't have the stomach for it, but someone close to him did. "Who?" Kyle looked away. "Ask Sheriff Mercer." Roy drove back to Redwater in silence. The cassette sat on the passenger seat like a living thing. Mercer's name echoed in his mind, turning over like gravel in a drum. He called her as he neared town. She didn't pick up. By the time he reached his shed, dusk had fallen, and the air was thick with mist. He poured a drink he didn't need, and set the tape on his desk beside the diary. 2 ghosts, side by side. He replayed the last few seconds of the recording, isolating the background voice. The software traced ambient noise. The faint hum of a generator, the buzz of neon. A diner. Roy froze. The Redwater diner still stood on Route 23. The neon sign still buzzed like that. He closed the laptop, grabbed his coat, and stepped into the night. The diner's parking lot was nearly empty when he arrived. The same booth where Claire had sat in the old photograph was still there, patched vinyl, cracked with age. Behind the counter, the waitress looked up. "Coffee? Maybe later." He scanned the walls, framed photos of old regulars, yellowed menus, and one portrait near the kitchen door. Sheriff Elaine Mercer, 24 years old, smiling beside Paul Weaver at a charity barbecue, dated September 1987. Roy's stomach went cold. He pulled out his phone and dialed Mercer again. This time, the call went straight to voicemail. He whispered into the receiver, "Elaine, we need to talk." About the photograph. About the tape outside. Headlights swept past the diner windows, then stopped. A black SUV idled under the sign, engine running. Roy watched it for a long moment before the lights cut out. Somewhere in the dark, a door opened. Roy Bannon waited in the parking lot long after the SUV drove away, headlights swallowed by the mist. The diner's neon sign flickered pink over the wet asphalt. He stared at Mercer's smiling face in the framed photo inside. Younger, unburdened, standing shoulder to shoulder with Paul Weaver. He'd trusted her. She was the one who'd reopened the file, the one who'd sent him the evidence photos, the one who'd said, "We'll get her justice." Now that smile from 1987 stared back at him like an echo of something she'd never told. By morning, Roy was parked outside the sheriff's office. The sky was still gray when Mercer arrived, steaming cup of coffee in one hand, badge glinting faintly on her jacket. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked, seeing his truck. He held up the photograph from the diner wall, a printout he'd taken before leaving. "You want to tell me what this is?" She froze for half a second, the smallest hitch in her breath, then covered it with a thin smile. "That's the county barbecue, 87. Whole town was there." "Not the whole town," Roy said quietly. "Just the people closest to the Weavers." He pointed to the faces. Paul Weaver, his daughter Claire, Earl Dunham in the back. And you. Standing between them, Mercer sipped her coffee. "You think I'm part of whatever happened?" "I think you were close enough to smell it." The sheriff looked away toward the courthouse square. The flag stirred lazily in the wind. "I was 24, she said finally. "First year in the department. Paul was my mentor." My friend Roy said nothing. The word friend hung heavy. "I didn't know what he'd done," Mercer said. "Not until it was too late." "You were there that night." She turned sharply. "How would you know that?" He set the cassette tape on the hood between them. Claire's last recording. The background noise. Generator, neon buzz. "That sounds from the diner. You were in the photo, same week she vanished. And Paul's voice is on the tape." Mercer's jaw tightened. "You shouldn't have that." "I do." "And I'm not the only one. My producer's got a copy in Austin, ready to publish." Her eyes flicked to the tape, then back to him. The silence stretched thin as wire. "Walk with me," she said finally. They crossed the square toward the river overlook. The sun had begun to rise, laying pale gold across the water. "Paul came to me the night Claire disappeared," Mercer began, her voice low. "Said she'd run off with Earl Dunham. He wanted me to help search." We drove out past the diner, down by the river road. He said she'd left a note. "Did you see it?" She nodded. "It was fake." Even then I knew, but I didn't call him on it. He was drunk, angry, talking nonsense about keeping the family name clean. He dropped me at the station around 2 a.m., said he was going to talk to Earl himself. I didn't hear from him again for 2 days. When I did, he said it was handled, Roy repeated. Mercer stopped walking. I thought he'd scared her off, that she'd show up in Dallas or Houston. But when the rumors started about the well, I knew. I just couldn't prove it. You covered for him." "I was young and stupid," she said, eyes shining now. "And he was the only one who believed I had what it took to wear the badge." After that, I kept my mouth shut and climbed the ranks. And I've been trying to make up for it ever since Roy studied her face. The lines there weren't just age. They were penance. "You know he didn't act alone," he said. "Earl poured the concrete, but Paul didn't have the strength to kill him afterward." "You know who did?" Mercer didn't answer. Kyle Landry said, "Someone close to him did." "That's you, isn't it?" She looked away, toward the slow-moving water. "When Earl disappeared, Paul came to me again. He said Earl had threatened to go to the papers, that he'd confess everything. I told Paul to let me handle it. I went to Earl's trailer that night, tried to get him to back off. He grabbed me, hard, said he'd bury me next to her. I panicked, hit him with a wrench. He didn't get up." Roy exhaled, slow and heavy. "I didn't mean to kill him," she whispered. "I buried him there because Paul told me where to get the concrete. Said it would tie up the story. He died 15 years later, thinking it had." "And you let the file go cold," Roy said. "I reopened it when I took office," she said. "Every year I told myself I'd confess, but then the county re-elected me, and the weight just grew heavier. When you started the podcast, I thought maybe that was my penance, to help you find her without exposing what I'd done." Roy stared at her. "You called me, didn't you? The tip line. That was you." She nodded once. "I used a caller ID spoofing service to make it show Kyle's landline. He was the only one still connected to that circle. I knew it'd look convincing." The wind carried a faint whistle through the grass. Roy ran a hand over his face. "You could have told me from the start. I needed you to dig. People don't believe a sheriff confessing to murder, but they'll believe a detective uncovering it." He turned away, heart pounding. "You're asking me to finish your confession for you. I'm asking you to make sure Claire's story gets told before mine does." That evening, Roy sat in his shed, the tape deck rolling softly as he replayed the conversation from the river. Mercer's voice cracked on the word wrench. He looked at the photo tacked above his board. Claire, smiling in the passenger seat of the red Cadillac. She'd never see 30, never see justice in a courtroom. He hit record. Episode 49. The barbecue photo. Every secret has a caretaker. In Redwater, it was Sheriff Elaine Mercer. She was there when Claire died. She was there when Earl followed. And she's still here, guarding the story she helped bury. He turned off the mic. The silence that followed was almost holy. A knock sounded at the shed door. Slow, deliberate. Roy tensed. "Who is it?" Mercer's voice came through quiet, steady. "We're done running, Roy. Tomorrow morning, I'm going to Waco. I'll tell them everything." When she left, the night felt heavier. Roy poured a drink, stared out at the dark. Somewhere beyond the pines, a siren wailed, faint, rising, fading. He whispered to himself, "Tomorrow, this town finally wakes up." The next morning broke clear and hard-edged, the way Texas mornings sometimes do after too many gray days. Roy Bannon drove the hour to Waco behind Sheriff Elaine Mercer's SUV. Neither used the radio. The only sound was wind against glass and the faint whine of tires on the highway. They reached the McLennan County Justice Center just after 9. The lot was already full of news vans. Word had leaked. Mercer stepped out first, uniform pressed, hair tied tight, her badge catching sunlight. Reporters surged forward. "Sheriff Mercer!" "Is it true you're resigning? Do you have a statement on the Redwater remains?" She didn't answer. Roy followed, recorder in his pocket rolling quietly. Inside, the hallway smelled of old coffee and disinfectant. The district attorney, a lean man named Cruz, met them in a conference room. "Elaine," he said carefully, "you want to go on record?" Mercer nodded. Under oath. Cruz glanced at Roy. He's not counsel. He's witness, she said. He's the reason this is happening. Roy sat in the corner, notebook open. The clock ticked loud. Mercer's voice when she began was steady, almost rehearsed. She recounted the same story she'd told Roy by the river, Paul Weaver's panic, Earl Dunham's threats, the confrontation gone wrong. But as she spoke, the details grew sharper, darker. I hit him once. He fell. I thought he was still breathing. Paul came later with the truck. We buried him. He said if I loved the badge, I'd forget it ever happened. Cruz didn't interrupt. When she finished, the silence sat heavy. You realize this confession makes you complicit in 2 homicides, he said finally. Mercer nodded. Yes. Why now? Because the girl deserved more than my silence, she said. And because I'm tired. Roy watched her hands shake as she signed the statement. When it was done, she stood, handed over her badge, and turned toward him. You can tell your story now. Outside, the press was waiting. Microphones thrust forward like spears. Sheriff Mercer, are you admitting guilt? Mr. Bannon, did your podcast force this confession? Roy shielded his eyes. No comment. But the story was already out. By sunset, every network in the region carried the headline, Texas Cold Case Solved. Sheriff confesses to 1987 cover-up. That evening, Roy sat in the dark of his shed, the glow from his laptop flickering against the walls. The town outside felt stunned into silence, like a church after the last hymn. He played back the raw audio of Mercer's confession, listening to the tremor beneath her calm words. He could edit it into his next episode, make it the crescendo of the season. It would explode online. Vindication for Claire, exposure for everyone who'd failed her. But another voice in his head, older, quieter, asked if he was just burying Mercer a second time, this time under headlines instead of concrete. He poured a cup of coffee gone cold and stared at the red diary on the desk. Claire's handwriting shimmered faintly under the lamplight. He hit record. Episode 50. The Confession. I have on tape the admission of Sheriff Elaine Mercer to 2 crimes, one of panic, one of silence. She will face justice in court, not in rumor. What follows is her own voice. He stopped the recording before playing the confession. His finger hovered over the publish button. He thought of Doris Weaver, alone in her nursing home room. He thought of Mercer's lined face at the river, the way she'd said, I'm tired. Roy exhaled and clicked Save Draft. Not publish, not yet. Hours passed. He sat with the hum of the refrigerator and the tick of the wall clock. At midnight, a knock rattled the shed door, sharp, urgent. Roy rose slowly. Who's there? Cruz, came the DA's voice. Roy opened the door. The man looked grave. We have a problem. Elaine Mercer's missing. Roy's chest tightened. Missing? She was supposed to be transferred to county lockup at 10. Never showed. Her car's gone. Roy grabbed his coat. You check her house? Deputies are there now. Roy's mind raced. Mercer had confessed, signed papers, surrendered everything. Why run now? Unless... He grabbed the recorder and keys. If she's not home, there's only one place she'd go. Fog rolled across County Road 54 like memory returned. The headlights from Roy's truck sliced through pale vapor, revealing the sagging Weaver fence ahead. The crime scene tape still fluttered in the dark. The well stood open again, ringed with frost, silent as an open mouth. Mercer's SUV sat 50 yards away, engine off, driver's door open. Roy called out, Elaine! No answer, just the rustle of grass. He approached slowly, flashlight sweeping over the weeds. Near the well, a single boot print marked the mud, then another. He reached the rim and looked down. At first, he saw only his own reflection in the shallow water, then a flash of silver, her badge glinting up from the darkness below. Roy staggered back, heart pounding.
No, no, Elaine!
He called Cruz, voice shaking.
She's here?
She's gone. The line was silent for a long moment. Then the DA said softly,
Maybe that was her way of finishing it.
Roy stared at the open well, breath turning white in the cold. For 38 years it had swallowed everyone tied to the story. Claire, Paul, Earl, and now the woman who'd carried their sins. He switched on his recorder one last time. Episode 51 and the well closes. Justice doesn't always come with handcuffs. Sometimes it comes as water-swallowing sound, or a confession whispered into fog. Sheriff Elaine Mercer ended her life tonight, at the same place Claire Weaver's began and ended. The ground here remembers everything, his voice cracked, but he didn't stop. Tomorrow I'll hand this recording to the DA, and maybe, finally, this town can sleep. He turned off the recorder. The night answered with quiet. The well waited, moonlight trembling across its surface like breath. For the first time in decades, Redwater was quiet. Not the ordinary quiet of a small Texas town between shifts, but the deep, stunned silence that settles after a storm. The well had taken its last name, and in doing so had emptied the place of something, fear, maybe, or guilt. Reporters packed up their cameras after 2 days. The satellite vans rolled away, leaving muddy ruts in front of the courthouse. Headlines gave way to new tragedies somewhere else. But for those who lived here, the echo lingered. Roy Bannon sat in the corner booth of the diner that had birthed half the town's rumors. The neon sign outside buzzed faintly, repaired since his last visit. A new waitress poured him coffee and recognized him immediately. "You're the podcast man," she said softly, "the one who found her." He nodded, eyes fixed on the window. Outside, fog rose off the asphalt like smoke. "My mama said Sheriff Mercer was a good woman," the waitress added. "Said she must have had her reasons." "She did," Roy said. "They always do." He spent the next week recording in fragments. Episode 52, Fallout. When a town's secret dies, the people left behind try to fill the silence. Some with prayer, some with whiskey, some with talk. Me, I hit record. He drove through the outskirts, capturing ambient sound. The creak of the water tower, the whine of cicadas, the hum of streetlights that buzzed all night. Each sound had been there in 1987. Each one had heard what no one told. The DA's office ruled Mercer's death a suicide. Paul Weaver's estate, long settled, was reopened for civil inquiry. Doris Weaver's nursing home phone line stayed busy with reporters until staff took it off the hook. Roy didn't call her right away. He didn't know what to say. 3 days later, he did. "Mrs. Weaver, it's Roy Bannon." A pause, then frail but steady. "I know your voice. I've been listening." "They found everyone now," he said. "Yes, the earth gives back what we take," she murmured. "Did she suffer?" "No," Roy lied gently. "Not long. Then maybe I can rest." He hesitated. "They'll ask if you want a memorial." Doris sighed. "No, I want her name to live quietly now. Let the noise belong to you." After the call, Roy sat for a long time staring at the waveform on his recorder. The conversation preserved in digital static, soft and eternal. He uploaded the final episode a week later. Title: The Town That Slept. He spoke slowly, his voice rough from sleepless nights. "There's a kind of silence you only find in towns like this, where the wind moves through cedar and tin, and everyone knows who's buried under which field. Redwater kept its silence for 38 years. Claire Weaver's story isn't just about what was done to her, it's about what was allowed to stay hidden. Paul Weaver built his life on pride, Earl Dunham on fear, Elaine Mercer on shame. But shame's just another kind of concrete. It hardens until someone cracks it open." He paused, letting the sound of crickets fill the space. If you ever drive through Central Texas, take County Road 54 until the pavement ends. You'll see a patch of earth where the grass grows greener, fed by rainwater and memory. That's where Redwater buried its ghosts. Maybe we can all let them rest. Now. He stopped recording but didn't save the file right away. Outside, thunder murmured on the horizon. The first spring storm rolling in. The next morning his inbox flooded. Messages from listeners, national outlets, documentary producers. The story had gone viral. Hero Detective reopens 1987 cold case. True crime podcaster solves mystery law enforcement ignored. The praise felt hollow. He'd promised himself closure, but all he felt was the strange weight of everyone else's attention pressing down. He drove to the old Weaver property one last time. The county had fenced it off, posted no trespassing signs. Wildflowers had started pushing through the disturbed soil around the well. A small wooden cross leaned beside the fence, unmarked. Roy stood there until the sky darkened. The wind smelled of rain and iron. When he finally turned back to the truck, lightning flashed across the fields, illuminating the distant silos where Earl Dunham once worked. He thought about the sound concrete makes when it cracks. The same dull pop the human heart makes when it breaks quietly enough that no one hears. That night, back in his shed, he listened to his own voice on playback. The narration sounded older than he remembered. He opened a new file and spoke without notes. Maybe this isn't about justice. Maybe it's about confession. Every person in Redwater carried a piece of that night. I did too. I wanted to be the man who fixed what others broke, but I was just another set of hands digging where I didn't belong. The truth doesn't set you free. It just changes what chains you wear. He saved it, titled simply, Final Cut, and shut the laptop. The storm hit around midnight. Rain hammered the tin roof, washing the air clean. In the flashes of lightning, he saw the evidence board still pinned with faces. Claire, Paul, Earl, Mercer. Each photo fluttering slightly in the draft from the window. He let the wind take one or two loose corners. Let the story breathe. Outside, thunder rolled across the hills, distant and steady. Redwater slept again. 2 weeks passed before Roy Bannon realized he'd stopped checking the mail. When he finally opened the box, it was stuffed with envelopes, letters from listeners, producers, law schools, and television companies. They all wanted the same thing, to make the silent mile bigger. He stacked the letters on his kitchen table and stared at them. Fame had found him, and it felt like another kind of burial. Louder, brighter, and just as heavy. On the counter, his phone buzzed again, a Los Angeles area code. He ignored it. The calls always came at dinner time, like telemarketers hawking morality. That evening, the sky turned the color of rusted steel. Roy sat on the porch with a glass of cheap bourbon, the ice melting fast in the heat. Across the yard, the evidence board through the shed window still glowed faintly from the desk lamp he'd left on. He'd tried taking it down once, got through 2 pushpins before stopping. Every photo was a nail in memory, every thread another heartbeat of the story. His phone buzzed again. This time he answered. Bannon. Detective, this is Grace Collier with Lone Star Public Broadcasting. We'd love to bring your podcast to TV, film on location, dig into the psychology of small-town guilt. America's obsessed with Redwater right now. Roy sipped his drink. America's obsessed with ghosts, not guilt. Grace chuckled. Same thing, isn't it? No, he said, and hung up. The porch light flickered, and he sat a while longer, listening to cicadas saw through the warm dark. The next morning, the DA called. Roy, media's asking for your raw files. Audio of Mercer's confession, your discovery of the diary, all of it. You can hand them over voluntarily, or they'll subpoena. Roy leaned against the counter, jaw tight. If they air that confession, they'll turn her into a headline, not a human. She was an officer of the law, Roy. This is already public record. He hung up without another word. The recorder sat on the table, still containing hours of unused audio. His field notes, conversations, whispers to himself during the long nights. He'd always promised transparency, truth without filters, but now he wasn't sure anyone could hear the truth through the noise. He played a random file. October 3rd, 1987. The hum on the tape before Claire's voice. That's not background noise. It's a generator. Means she was at the diner when she recorded it. I can hear a man in the distance, Paul or Earl or both. He stopped the playback. The sound of his younger voice, confident and certain, felt like an accusation. He reached for the external hard drive, the one that held every recording, every image, every document. The heart of the silent mile. Then he unplugged it. By afternoon, the inbox had doubled. Offers, interviews, film contracts. One message stood out, from Nora Halbrook, a documentary producer he respected. Her tone was different, respectful, restrained. Roy, I'm not asking to sensationalize it. I want to tell it right. Let's meet in Austin. No cameras, just talk. He hesitated, then replied, tomorrow. Noon. Austin shimmered with heat the next day. The cafe near the Capitol smelled of espresso and cedar wood polish. Roy found Nora already waiting, laptop closed, 2 coffees on the table. She was mid-30s, sharp-eyed but soft-voiced. Mr. Bannon, she said, standing to shake his hand. Or should I say the man who solved Redwater? He grimaced. Don't call me that. The ground solved Redwater. I just listened. She smiled faintly. Then you're one of the last good ones. They talked for an hour. She'd followed the podcast from the start, every episode. You built something honest, she said, but the story's too big to end in a shed. It belongs to everyone now. Roy stirred his coffee. Belonging's what got Claire killed. Too many people thought she belonged to them. Her father, her lover, her town. Nora studied him. You think telling it makes you another thief? Maybe, he said. Maybe I'm just polishing the headstone. She nodded slowly. If you decide to do this, do it on your terms. You write it. You narrate it. You control the ending. Roy looked out the window. A bus passed, painted with a streaming service logo advertising another true crime series. All stories end the same now. Tragedy wrapped for consumption. He turned back to her. If I ever tell it again, it'll be to bury it properly. Nora smiled sadly. Then that's the film. The story of a man burying a story. He drove home at dusk, the sunset bleeding through low clouds like a slow fire. When he reached the shed, he found the door ajar, pushed open by the wind. Inside, the evidence board had fallen. Photographs scattered across the floor like a deck of ghosts. He gathered them one by one. Claire's portrait, Paul's mugshot, Earl's co-op badge, Mercer's official photo. He laid them in a shoebox, closed the lid, and wrote on it, "Do not open." Then he vacuum-sealed the external drive with 2 desiccant packs, double-bagged it, wrapped the bundle in brown paper, and drove 15 miles to the Brazos River Bridge. The water below ran dark and slow. He stood for a while, holding the package in both hands. Episode 53, he whispered into his phone recorder, the final cut. Sometimes the truth's like a body. It needs to be buried where no one will dig it up again. He dropped the package. It hit the surface with a soft splash, vanished into the current, and was gone. He watched until only ripples remained, catching the faint orange of the dying light. Later, back home, he poured the last of the bourbon and sat at his desk. He opened a new file and spoke softly. This will be my last episode. The story's over. The people are gone. The earth has them now. For those who listened, thank you for caring. For those who grieve, keep looking. The world's full of silent miles. He clicked stop and saved it under a single word. End. Then he turned off the light. The shed fell into darkness, and the night outside was finally still. It rained for 3 straight days. Not the soft, polite drizzle that nourishes pasture land, but the hard, endless kind that turns rivers into jaws. Lightning crawled across the sky like veins, and thunder rolled through Redwater until the windows shook. Roy Bannon sat in the dark, listening to the weather radio crackle warnings. Flash flood alert for McLennan and Bastrop counties. Avoid low-lying bridges. The bridge. He tried not to think about the brown paper package swallowed by the Brazos 2 weeks earlier. The hard drive that held every confession, every ghost. He'd told himself the current would take it far enough that it would vanish, that the river would keep his secret better than any lockbox. Now, he wasn't so sure. On the 4th morning, the rain stopped. The sun broke through in thin, reluctant shafts. The air smelled of wet cedar and silt. The first call came from Sheriff's Dispatch, temporary replacement staff covering Mercer's post. Detective Bannon? We got a situation near the bridge at County 17. Some debris washed up after the storm. You might want to see this. Roy pulled on his boots and drove out, tires slicing through puddles. The land looked raw, rinsed down to its bones. At the bridge, deputies in ponchos were already wading through the mud. A young officer waved him over. It's a mess down there. Logs, tires, and something wrapped in plastic. Roy's throat went dry. What kind of plastic? Looks like packaging paper. Heavy. We thought it might be a body at first. He climbed down the embankment, boots sinking deep. The air smelled of river mud and metal. Near the reeds lay a brown bundle snagged in the roots of a fallen pecan tree. Roy knelt, heart hammering. The wrapping had split open along one side. Inside, a tangle of wires, a cracked hard drive casing, and the faint outline of the sticker he'd scrawled weeks earlier. Silent Mile. The river had given it back. He stared for a long time before saying, "Bag it. Take it to the evidence room in Waco. Chain of custody under my name. Detective," the deputy said carefully. "What is it?" Roy hesitated. "A mistake that won't stay buried." They hauled the bundle up to the road, the wet paper slapping against their legs. The sky was still low and bruised. When the truck pulled away with the evidence, Roy stayed behind, staring at the swollen river. He spoke softly to himself. "Guess you weren't done talking after all." That night the storm returned in spirit, thunder far off, flickering lightning without rain. Roy sat in his shed, staring at the recovered drive now sealed in an evidence bag. The casing was cracked, but the inner disc looked intact. He should have destroyed it, burned it. Instead, he called an old friend, Miguel Ramos, a tech with the county IT department. "Miguel, it's Roy. I need a recovery job. No questions. Another cold case?" "Something like that." Miguel laughed. "Bring it by in the morning. We'll see if your ghosts are still talking." By noon the next day, the rain had given way to humid sunshine. Steam rose from the parking lot outside the county building. Inside, Miguel's office smelled of coffee and old electronics. He plugged the damaged drive into a reader, humming tunelessly. "Let's see what we've got." Roy stood behind him, arms folded. The computer screen flickered, then filled with folders, audio, images, text files. Everything had survived. "All here," Miguel said. "Even the stuff you deleted." Roy's pulse slowed to a heavy thud. "Deleted?" Miguel clicked open a hidden directory labeled Drafts. Dozens of audio files appeared, raw material Roy had recorded but never uploaded. One file stood out. REC 000_final_rehearsal_1087.wave. Dated the night Claire vanished. Roy frowned. "That can't be right. I wasn't even—" Miguel clicked play before he could finish. Static. Then faint voices, blurred but unmistakable. A man shouting, a girl crying. Another voice, female, sharp, panicked. "Paul, stop! She's bleeding!" Roy's skin went cold. Miguel turned. "Is that Mercer?" Roy listened closer. The male voice, Paul Weaver, slurred with drink. The girl, Claire, pleading. Then the woman again, terrified, shouting, "Help me get her in the car!" The tape ended in static. Roy swallowed hard. "That's from the night she died." Miguel looked confused. "But how did it end up on your drive?" Roy sat down slowly. It must have been copied from Mercer's files, or from evidence she kept off record. She was holding this back. "Insurance," Miguel whistled. "You realize what this means? This isn't just her confession. It's the proof." Roy nodded. "Yeah, and now it's in my hands again." That evening, he drove back to the Weaver property. The land was damp, the wildflowers flattened from rain. The well stood quiet, a ring of moss and memory. He placed the recovered drive on the rim, the plastic bag crinkling in the breeze. "You just keep coming back, don't you?" he whispered. "Even after I try to bury you." He stared down at the dark water. Somewhere below, rain dripped in steady rhythm. In his mind, he heard Mercer's voice again from her confession. "I'm tired." Roy closed his eyes. "Me too." He picked up the drive, slipped it into his jacket, and walked back to the truck. The ghosts could stay restless a little longer, until he decided how to end their story for good. That night, thunder rolled far away over the plains. Roy sat with the recorder, the recovered file queued up but unplayed. His finger hovered over the button. If he released it, Claire would finally speak for herself. Mercer's words would be vindicated. The truth would be complete. But truth, he knew, was a double-edged mercy. He clicked the recorder on. Episode 54. After the flood. The river took what I gave it and brought it home. Maybe that's what truth does. It doesn't vanish. It waits for the right storm. I found something tonight, something I thought I destroyed. It's her voice. It's all of them. If you're hearing this, it means I made a choice, either to keep it buried or to let her speak. He paused, eyes wet, voice steady. I hope I made the right one. The night was windless when Roy finally pressed play. No storm now, no rain on the roof, only the soft hum of the recorder spinning up, like a breath before a confession. He sat alone in the shed. The walls seemed closer tonight, filled with the weight of 38 years and one buried girl who'd waited too long to be heard. The tape began with static. Then came a voice, faint, shaking, the voice of Claire Weaver. "If anyone finds this, please tell my mother I wasn't scared at the end. I just wanted to go home." Roy's hand clenched around the edge of the desk. The next sound was heavy breathing, then a man's voice. Paul Weaver, cold and impatient. "You should have kept your mouth shut, Claire. You don't know what you've done." "You hurt me," she cried. "You said you wouldn't." "You shouldn't have called him." A loud thud, a scuffle, furniture scraping. Then the unmistakable voice of a third person, a woman, pleading. "Paul, stop! She's your daughter." It wasn't Mercer. It was Elaine Mercer's mother, a midwife who'd worked for the Weavers back then. Something Roy had missed completely. He heard another shout, a crash, and Claire's sob, "Please, Daddy, stop!" followed by the wet, awful sound of impact. Then silence. Roy's breath hitched. The next noise was the slamming of a door, hurried footsteps, a car engine starting. Finally, Elaine Mercer's own voice, younger, steadier, whispering into the recorder. "I found her too late. He'd gone. I'll hide this until someone asks, until someone cares." The tape clicked off. Roy sat frozen. The shed felt colder than before, though sweat gathered at his temples. He played it again and again, hearing the subtle background sounds, the hum of a refrigerator, the chirp of night insects outside, the faint static of 1980s Texas air. He could almost smell the night Claire died. It wasn't a mystery anymore. It was a moment, preserved in dust and magnetism. After the third listen, Roy stood, pacing. His mind spun through years of interviews, transcripts, and dead-end reports. Mercer had carried this secret for decades. The town had punished her for silence when she'd been protecting the evidence all along. He turned on the recorder again, this time his own voice filling the quiet. "This is Roy Bannon. It's 11:43 p.m., March 22nd. I've heard the final recording. Claire Weaver's death wasn't an accident. It wasn't a disappearance. It was murder, witnessed, hidden, and buried by a town too proud to admit rot under its roots. I've been chasing a ghost. Turns out, she was screaming the whole time." His voice cracked. He shut off the recorder and sat in silence. At dawn, he drove back to Redwater. Mist clung to the ground like memory, the sky bruised with early light. The old courthouse steps gleamed wet from dew. He left the recorder on the sheriff's desk, the same desk Mercer had used. No note. Just the tape, labeled in his careful handwriting, Claire, her voice. When he stepped outside, the town was waking. A single truck passed, tires whispering over wet asphalt. Somewhere, a radio played a country song about forgiveness. Roy leaned against his car, watching the sunlight slide across the water tower. It hit him then. This was the ending. Not a podcast, not a story to edit. Just a small, quiet reckoning. 3 days later, national news broke again. 1987. Texas murder confession audio found. Final tape confirms Sheriff Mercer's secret investigation. DA announces closure of Redwater case after 38 years. The headline spread, but this time Roy didn't listen. He'd taken his name off the podcast feed, deleted his account, unlisted the episodes. The story belonged to Claire now. He visited Doris Weaver one last time. The nursing home smelled faintly of disinfectant and lavender. Doris looked thinner, but her eyes were clear. "You found her voice," she said as soon as he entered. "I did. And Paul, he can't hurt anyone anymore." She nodded slowly, her gaze drifting to the window. "I used to dream about that night. The phone ringing. The silence after. Now I think I'll sleep." Roy placed a small speaker on her nightstand and pressed play. Claire's voice filled the room, fragile, trembling, but alive. "Tell my mother I wasn't scared at the end." Tears slipped down Doris's face. She covered her mouth, eyes glistening. She was always brave. Roy waited until the recording ended, then turned off the speaker. "She's home," he said quietly. Doris smiled faintly. "So are you, son." That night, Roy drove out to the bridge one final time. The river had calmed, moving slow under a half moon. He stood by the railing, the cool wind brushing against his face. He thought about all the hours of tape, the interviews, the theories, the confessions, about the people who died for truth, and those who'd lived by burying it. He took out one last cassette, labeled in blue ink, Epilogue. He recorded softly, his voice low and steady. "This is Roy Bannon. If you're hearing this, it means the story's finally done. Truth isn't justice. It's something lonelier. Justice ends, truth echoes." Claire Weaver spoke at last, and the world listened. If you ever find yourself driving through Texas and the air feels heavier than it should, that's not heat. That's memory. Be kind to it. This is the end of the silent mile. He clicked off the recorder. The moonlight shimmered on the river's surface. Quiet, endless, forgiving. Roy dropped the tape into the current and watched it drift away until the water swallowed it whole. Then he turned and walked toward his truck, the gravel crunching softly under his boots. Behind him, the Brazos kept moving, steady as truth, slow as time. And for the first time in years, Roy Bannon didn't look back. The town of Redwater was quiet again. By summer, the fields along County Road 17 had dried into gold, the wildflowers gone. Only the faint trace of tire tracks remained near the old bridge, now repaired and repainted, its guardrails shining like bones under the Texas sun. A small plaque had been mounted on the side. In memory of Claire Weaver, 1970 to 1987. She found her voice. No ceremony, no cameras. Just the metal plate, warm under the sun, and a single ribbon tied around the post. Blue, the same color as her mother's eyes. Inside the Redwater Historical Museum, a new display had opened quietly in the corner room. A faded photograph of Claire smiled out from behind glass, beside the weathered diary, a cassette recorder, and a restored sheriff's badge belonging to Elaine Mercer. A small plaque read, "Evidence returned to the people of Redwater by Detective Roy Bannon, retired." Visitors came in small numbers. Some left notes, others simply stood, silent, in front of the tape recorder, as if waiting for it to speak again. Roy Bannon moved to a modest apartment outside Waco that summer. He stopped recording after episode 54. The feed went dark without warning. No goodbye message, no social media post. Yet his inbox filled with messages anyway, from strangers who said the story made them call their mothers, or reopen old family boxes, or finally talk about the night their own small-town vanished girl never came home. Roy never answered. He spent mornings fishing the slow bend of the Brazos, drinking coffee from a dented thermos, listening to nothing but water and birds. Sometimes he imagined voices in the wind, not haunting him, but reminding him that truth, once released, never fully disappears. Detective Morales took over Redwater's sheriff office after Mercer's death. She kept Mercer's name on the wall, not under disgraced, but service. She opened the first victim advocacy center the town had ever seen. At its dedication, she told the crowd, "Justice isn't about punishment. It's about listening to the people who were never heard." Behind her on a folding chair sat Doris Weaver, eyes closed, smiling faintly. Doris passed quietly in her sleep a few months later. Her bedside table held two things, a faded photo of Claire and the small speaker Roy had given her. The staff found it still plugged in, the light blinking softly, the last words paused halfway through the tape. "Tell my mother I wasn't scared at the end." The staff played it once before packing her belongings. The sound filled the hallway, fragile, trembling, and strangely peaceful. Lucia "Luce" Bannon, Roy's daughter, uploaded one final video to her father's dormant YouTube channel a year later. It opened with a black screen and the sound of the river. Her voice narrated, "He never wanted fame. He wanted silence. He said stories like this don't belong to the teller, they belong to the lost. My father died last winter, heart failure, alone in his cabin. But he left something behind. This." The screen faded to a grainy photo of Roy on the bridge, his face half lit, wind tugging at his jacket. He believed in truth, even when it broke him. So if you're here because of the silent mile, listen to what he left you. Then came Claire's voice again, restored from the original analog tape. "Please tell my mother I wasn't scared." The video ended with slow text on black, for every voice that was silenced, for every truth that waited too long. This story belongs to you now. The clip went viral overnight, not as a scandal, but as a kind of digital vigil. Millions watched, left comments, shared memories. The phrase, "she found her voice," began appearing in posts about missing persons, cold cases, and advocacy groups across the country. In time, the FBI's cold case unit credited the Redwater story with reopening 9 dormant Texas disappearances. Some were solved. Most were not. But people began looking again, and sometimes that was enough. Years later, the locals still told stories about Roy Bannon, that he'd been seen on foggy mornings walking the riverbank, hat low, recorder in hand, that his voice still played softly from the bridge railing when the wind blew just right. No one could prove it, but a few swore they'd heard a man's voice saying, "Keep listening." The podcast feed for The Silent Mile remained offline, but if you searched hard enough, you could find a hidden file uploaded under a random name, a 30-second clip, never listed in the episode count. It began with Roy's voice, faint and steady. We live our lives walking down miles of silence. Sometimes we leave footprints, sometimes we vanish. But if you listen close enough, under the noise, under the years, you'll hear someone calling your name. Then a pause, and Claire's whisper, barely audible through the static. "I'm home." The video ended with the sound of the river, not rushing, not angry, just moving, endlessly forward. In Redwater, the wind bent the wildflowers again. The plaque at the bridge gleamed under the sun. The town breathed. And the world kept turning, quieter but not silent.